And one of the reasons that we think this topic is important is that it is part of our strategic plan that was recently developed by the National Board. And they reworded the mission statement, the vision statement, and in the values you see inclusion and intersectionality. So we thought this would be important to understand more thoroughly what that means. So now we're pleased to have Dr. Zoe Spencer with us, and she has received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Howard University. She is a professor of sociology at the Virginia State University at Richmond, Virginia. And as Kate mentioned a little earlier, she was the recipient of AAUW legal advocacy funds because she was a plaintiff in a case of gender pay gap discrimination. And Kate and I heard her speak at the Illinois State Convention, and we thought she was a dynamic speaker, and we wanted to have her do a webinar for us. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Zoe. Take it away. Let's see. Right.
So first and foremost, are you ready?
Yes, we're ready for you to go.
Go all in. Well, first and foremost, I want to say thank you to the AAUW Illinois branch, and thank you for everybody who is joining in. Elaine, if we could go back to your title, the title slide. Okay, so today's topic is intersectionality, and I really love this slide because the slide kind of demonstrates what intersectionality is. And so before we actually go to Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality, I kind of want to give a visual of what intersectionality looks like, and also to provide some kind of historic context. And I don't want to go deep, but I want to give you all kind of a historic foundation of how intersectionality emerged, because I think it's critical that we understand how the term emerged so that as we use it and as we engage it, we make sure that it doesn't lose its meaning and its intensity. So the term intersectionality actually comes from Black feminism. And actually Black feminism is centered on how Black women experience gender bias based on the intersection of both race and gender. The term intersectionality was something that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw to look at how women who are not a homogeneous group experience oppressions at these different social constructs. So predominantly it looks at how gender is influenced by the intersection of race and gender, class and gender, sexuality and gender, ableism and gender, you can say religion and gender, and it goes on and on. And the assumption of the term intersectionality is that people are going to experience oppression based on, one, their proximity to heteropatriarchy. And when we talk about heteropatriarchy, we're talking about the dominance of heterosexual males, and also with the intersection, and everybody gets scared of the word, but also with the intersection of white supremacy as an ideology. And so intersectionality is born from the early works of Sojourner Truth, who was standing alongside the women's suffrage movement in the race, and who experienced a different form of oppression based on her construct of race and gender. You have Harriet Tubman, you have the work of Pat Hill Collins, Tricia Rose, Ida B. Wells, and other Black feminist theorists. And so intersectionality kind of is born from Black feminism and Black feminist thought. If you want to read more about that, you can look at the works of Pat Hill Collins. So Kimberly Crenshaw as the slide indicates, was the person who actually coined the term intersectionality. And of course, as the definition shows, it states that it is an academic term, it's a sociological term, it's also a term that's used in critical race theory that looks at the way that women in particular experience oppression based on those intersections. It really kind of shows up in work around both racial justice, social justice, activism, politics, state-sponsored violence, and policing, and of course, in the distribution of justice and/or equity. You can go to the next slide. Are there any questions, and am I talking too fast? So, intersectionality, the theory that the overlap of various social identities, such as race, gender, sexuality, and class, contributes to the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by an individual and also a collective. In Kimberly Crenshaw's work, she focused on queer intersectionality, the queer intersectionality approach, which would look at the intersection of sexuality and gender. The interconnected nature, of course, everybody can read, but the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage, and what I like to say also oppression. And I think probably kind of the focus of this work is really looking at being able to remove ourselves from the center and understand how women as a collective will experience different forms of oppression, different forms of discrimination based on their intersections. The two terms that I would like to talk about is one, homogeneity, and then heterogeneity. A lot of times where intersectionality is so powerful and so relevant, and I celebrate the work that AAUW is doing around intersectionality, because a lot of times as women, we're conditioned to believe that women experience oppression unilaterally, that we all have the same stance, we all have the same oppressions, but we don't. And when we as women are doing the work of promoting equality, promoting equity, promoting parity, promoting anti-discrimination and anti-oppression, it's really important to remove ourselves from the center. And the way that we remove ourselves from the center is understanding that our centeredness as women doesn't define the centeredness of other women, and that other women are going to experience oppression, experience discrimination, experience inequity, and experience inequality based on those social constructs, right? And so intersectionality is really about kind of debunking privilege. So let me give an example. I'm a Black woman, and so the assumption is that Black women experience oppression the same. I'm Black and I'm a woman, and I am from, nobody tells you all this, but I'm from Berry Farms, which is the projects in Washington, D.C. that is no more. But those are my three intersecting oppressions. I have a race oppression, a class oppression, and a gendered oppression. So those intersections are going to determine my proximity to power. However, even as a member of an oppressed group who experiences the oppressions at the intersection of race, class, and gender, there are also other oppressions. For example, I am a cisgender woman. I identify as she, her, hers, and they. If you want to call me they, that's fine too. However, my experience as a Black heterosexual working class woman is going to be different than the experience of a Black working class gay or lesbian bisexual woman. And so the concept of intersectionality is really, really about getting us to understand all of the different constructs of oppression. If I'm not clear, and this is for everybody because they asked me to do it, and so I'm going to do it how I do it. If I'm not clear about my privilege as a heterosexual woman, then I will take my oppressions and then invoke my oppressions on other groups or marginalize other groups who are not a part of my intersectional oppressions. I hate webs because I can't see anybody and I can't feel anybody. But do y'all feel me? Y'all with me? You can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So again, this is basically the same thing. In 2017, Kimberly Crenshaw made a statement, and she argued that intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. I'm gonna go again. Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQIA problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. Um, so in a work that I just coined, and when we're thinking about even the origin of feminism and the women's suffrage movement, what was interesting is that in a work that I just did, I talked about how when the women's suffrage movement convened, um, depending on the intersection, the binary intersection of race and gender with reference to pay equity, white women were being excluded from the workplace and Black women were being systematically forced to provide free labor. So here you have a gendered experience, but the racial binary created two different forms of oppression, exclusion and enslavement. And so the quote that Crenshaw uses is really trying to get women to focus on, to use this lens to focus on how closely or how far away we're situated from power. You can go to the next slide. So the matrix of domination is a theoretical concept that was actually developed by one of my favorite theorists, Pat Hill Collins. If you get a chance to look at her work, she has written several books, but one of her books is called Black Feminist Thought. And Black Feminist Thought kind of combines like Pat Hill Collins and I forgot what she just slipped my mind. They don't use the term intersectionality. It's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, but the work of Black feminist theorists really talks about intersectionality without using the term intersectionality. And so the matrix of domination looks at how, in particular, Western culture, and if we want to just be specific to America, how America systems. So come with me for a second, y'all. And I'm going to use words, but they're real words, and we're going to have to get used to the words. And so when you're looking at the construction of America, America is a country whose systems are based on the ideology of heteropatriarchy, that is the dominance of heterosexual males, and it's also based on the ideology of white supremacy, and that is the belief that the white race is dominant over other races. And in that those ideologies kind of situate power. And then the matrix of domination deals with how power or one's proximity or a group's proximity to power is predicated on these ideologies. And so Pat Hill Collins develops the matrix of domination, absolutely, the matrix of domination that looks at if white capitalist class heterosexual males are considered the dominant class, how does power get diluted and how does oppression form based on other groups' proximity to that power? So even when we talk about the concept of class privilege, or when we talk about the concept of white privilege, or when we talk about the concept of cisgender privilege, all of those privileges are based on the ideologies that are situated. And people get scared when we use the term white supremacy or heteropatriarchy, like, what is that? I'm not a racist. But the reality of it is that these ideologies are embedded in our systems, and they are manifested through our interaction and our exchange with the system. So if the humans within the systems embody the ideologies, then we replicate those ideologies, and then we solidify those power dynamics that come from those ideologies in our institutions. So Pat Hill Collins' work, The Matrix of Domination, looks at the male as being dominant, white males as being dominant, patriarchal traditions defining gender roles. So let's talk about gender, the construct of gender, and gender role socialization, gender role characteristics, gender role stereotypes. Men are supposed to be assertive and dominant, and women are supposed to be pious, domestic, and pure. Those are ideologies that are embedded in our patriarchal systems, right? And those are the ideologies that ground inequities and discrimination in the workforce and institutions, etc. The concept of heterosexuality, right? That the heterosexual is supposed to be dominant. And so those heterosexual ideologies ground power dynamics. Young, and this is so deep because we don't even think about youth as a power, but youth and the concept of being young as being dominant really embeds ableism, and it embeds ageism. English speaking, let's talk about it because I know y'all are out there, and let's think about some of the biases that we hold, that we're in America and you're supposed to speak English. And so if you're English speaking, how that dominant cultural value embeds power dynamics. Educated, we use big words, we go to college, how that education embeds power dynamics. Christianity as the dominant religion, how Christianity as an ideology embeds power dynamics in our system. And of course, the term rich, which corresponds with class, how classism embeds power dynamics. And so this matrix of domination really outlines some of our dominant cultural values, and then looks at how those dominant cultural values are situated in our systems and situated in our institutions, and how then they establish who is going to be powerful and who is going to be powerless. I'm going to say it again. How it situates who is going to be powerful and who is going to be powerless. So let me just give an example. Absolutely, absolutely. And Marge, the one-sided and one-minded society really comes from how the ideologies get embedded in our systems, but then how our internalization of the ideologies lend to the way that we also contribute to power dynamics. As an example, you can't be, and Elaine, you all remember, you can't be a reverse oppressor, right? So if we're members of organizations that are supposed to be promoting equity and equality and parity, and for example, I am a Black woman, or you all are white women, and you all have an organization that is dealing with oppression or inequality or discrimination based on gender, but then you use your white privilege to oppress or discriminate against people based on your white privilege, or based on your class privilege, or based on your Christian privilege, etc. That's the way that we then also contribute to marginalizing other groups of people unknowingly, so sometimes, and sometimes knowingly so. And so understanding that matrix of domination, absolutely. Age as well, how the younger employers are now looking for the young blood, and so they don't value the experience and the wisdom of the elders. And so all of these pieces, all of these social constructs really embed power, and the way that we embrace and or understand our proximity to power is very important in making sure that we don't become reverse oppressors or we don't become purveyors of marginalizing other groups that are not a part of our social construct.
Zoe, can I
Yes,
give
ma'am.
an example?
Absolutely.
In our organization, we all contribute to the national organization to support fellowships and grants for the various purposes of our organization. And I have heard some members might be upset that we're giving maybe more than half of the scholarships to women of color. And that is an example. We need to be sharing equally. I mean, sharing with people who were oppressed or didn't have the ability to get an advanced degree. They are outstanding students, but because of the intersection of perhaps class or economic status and women of color, they did not have the opportunity. And our scholarship is a way that we can give that opportunity to balance the scales a bit.
Absolutely. And that's so beautiful. I think that there are two components to that too. Because equity is not, and this isn't to what you said, Elaine, but I think one of the things, and I think the fear is always, and that is, I, that's always the intricacy when you're dealing with the matrix of domination. I think sometimes secretly, when we're not conscious, when we're not awakened, and I know that everybody here is going to be awakened, but when we're not awakened, secretly we admire the power, right? And secretly we don't want to be oppressed, but we want to take on power positions within an oppressed system, right? And so when we feel that another group is encroaching upon our privilege, or encroaching upon our power, it gets a little bit tricky. But true parity and true equity deals not only with giving a handout or what have you, but also inviting people to the table and then understanding their intersection and respecting their intersection as much as we respect our own. Does that make sense?
Right.
So yeah, that's an exceptional example. But the concept of intersectionality is not just giving people a seat at the table, but also allowing a person to carve a table out for themselves, if that makes sense. So we can go to the next slide. And if you all have questions, like I hate just like rolling through, but yeah. So this matrix of oppression, Pat Hill Collins calls it the matrix of domination. This is an example of how it looks. Again, on the left, we have the column that basically establishes the social construct. Race is defined as a social construct. People want to make a big deal of race, but race is really a social construct that was really developed for the purpose of maintaining power dynamics. Sex is our biology, but sex and gender where are also social constructs. Sex is biology, but gender is also a social construct where society is assigning characteristics based on one's sex. Sexual orientation, class, ability versus disability, religion, age. And I'm sure if we were to sit down and like really have like a hash out session, we could probably add other identities, quote unquote, social identities to the category. So the left are the social identity categories, and then the column that is highlighted to the right, the privileged social groups. That goes back to what I was saying about the matrix of domination and how these social groups establish power. So when you're talking about race, the ideology of white supremacy situates white people as the power dynamic or the privilege. When you're talking about sex, of course, men, heterosexual men, situate that power. And from that power, other men gain privilege. Gender, gender conforming heteropatriarchy, heteropatriarchal men situate that power, and from that situation, people of that group maintain privilege. Sexual orientation, heterosexuality is the center, so heterosexuality situates that power, and those who are in that group receive privilege. Class, capitalism ensures that rich people or wealthy people situate power, and from that power, privilege is achieved. Ability versus disability, of course, able-bodied people situate that power, and from that power, privilege is achieved. Religion, um, Protestants, Christianity situate power, and so from that power, privilege, and of course, age. Adults, but not just elder adults. When you're dealing with age, it's that working, that 20 something to about 50 cutoff point, and then when you get 50 like me, they kick you in the boat. But that ageism situates power, and from that power, privilege is achieved. Intersectionality deals with one's proximity to privilege and one's proximity to power based on social identity. Y'all with me? Absolutely. Absolutely, Mary. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have a theory about that, but I'm going to go to the border social groups. So these border social groups, and really, if you really think about it, society has us all fighting against each other in real life. And we fight against each other based on our social constructs. And so that really keeps us divided from the ultimate goal of ensuring a greater parity and or a greater equality in society, global society, not just American society, but global society. So the border social groups are the ones who are on the border, the ones who have combinations of the social identities, and so they're on the border. The targeted social groups, and again, the border social groups still deal with one's proximity to power. For example, when you're looking at race and it says biracial people, well, biracial people have both the dominant cultural or the privileged cultural or racial value, and then the powerless or the underprivileged social value. And so they remain on that border. They probably not so much with really, for real, probably not any of these, because they all still experience oppressions. But the way that they experience oppressions, the assumption will be that they will experience oppression at a lesser degree than those members of the targeted social groups. Before I go to the targeted social groups, Pat Hill Collins also has a term. It's called a binary construction. And in her matrix of domination, she talks about the binary. I want you all to understand so that, like, when we walk away, it's not like, oh, Z was talking the black mambo jumbo, the heterosexual mambo jumbo. But to understand that when you have a power dynamic, that power dynamic or that power identity creates a binary. So if you're dealing with white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, which gives white heterosexual capitalist men dominance, then the opposite of white is going to be black. The opposite of capitalist or wealthy is going to be poor. And the opposite of a man is going to be a woman. Those are the proximities. So you're talking about these binary constructions or these binary proximities to power. So when you look at the targeted social groups, it's not something that's made up, but it's looking at how far away people are from that proximity of power. And those people will be powerless, and they'll also be the targeted social groups. To go back historically to that, though, because if you take it out of the historic context, then it's like, oh, the Asians and the Blacks and Latinos are just the targeted social groups. Well, they're not targeted. But when you look at the history of race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, especially in America, but globally, then there is a stereotype that comes along with those targeted social groups. And those stereotypes are designed to preserve the ideologies that manifest and sustain power. I'm going to say it again. The stereotypes are necessary, and they're the necessary ideologies that sustain and maintain power dynamics. So if you have an ideology of white supremacy, then you cannot value the contribution of people of Asian or African or Latino descent. If you have an ideology of patriarchy, then you cannot value the contribution of women. If you have an ideology that values heterosexuality, then you cannot value the contribution of the LGBTQIA community. And so this targeted social group is not like this, oh, they're just targeted. It comes with the history because power is preserved through ideologies. Ideologies are embedded in systems. And the ideologies are not just the ideologies of superiority, but they're also the ideologies of inferiority that couple that. Does that make sense? Isn't cisgender woman the preferred term to bio women? Listen, Mary, I really don't know because I don't keep up with the language, so I'm not even going to pretend to know. You're talking about biological women? And if that's the case, then yes. So the pay gap. Woo, 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 woo. Go ahead, Elaine.
This is a good example of the hierarchy in action.
Absolutely. And if you all get a chance to go on the AAUW, the national AAUW website, they actually have a breakdown of the pay gap. And so the right now, women on average earn only 80 cents. You have 77, we'll go with that. But women on average earn 80 cents of what white males earn. And of course, that number goes down with the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. And so you have white women who earn 77 cents on the dollar, and you have Black women earning 64, and then we have our Latinx women who only earn 56 cents on the dollar of what white males make. Talk about inequity. Talk about gender equity in pay. So you see in the pay gap, when you're talking about salary equity, pay equity, the pay gap is absolutely reflective of the intersection. And of course, you know, these are on average, but then when you look at the class of women, which also corresponds to the work that women do, those numbers are significantly less. And so the intersection, the intersectionality really influences discrimination, especially influences salary inequity, education, and opportunities and access to resources in America. So, Elaine, I think that goes back to what you were talking about, the importance of understanding the structural barriers of why, because other than that, you know, we just assume that other people don't want to do it. They don't want to work, and they're not smart as we are. And if they just worked harder, they would be able to get ahead. But these structural inequities that are based on proximity to power absolutely influence where women are and how they experience oppression in America in particular, but really how they experience oppression globally.
And whether they have opportunities or not.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And Elaine, I think that is so pivotal. That is so pivotal and we have to be mindful. And I think that's coming up, but we have to be mindful. Understanding intersectionality means being able to use a lens, not just to understand our own oppression, but being able to also use that same lens to understand people's oppressions that we might not be a part of. And that has to be the foundation. Using a lens through which we understand other people's oppressions that we may not be a part of. And then being able to monitor ourselves to make sure that we're not inadvertently becoming reverse oppressors, even in our activism. We can go to the next one. Any questions so far? So cisgender privileges. I wanted to pull out cisgender privileges because and it can be any privilege, right? Like, and for a moment, I just if we were in like a room together, I would say, write down your privilege, and even if you don't do it right now, take a moment even after this to write down your privilege. And when you write down your privilege, write down how your privilege or not acknowledging your privilege could lead to the oppression and or exclusion of another group or the marginalization of another group. I'm going to say it again. Write down your privilege and then think about how not can inadvertently lead to the oppression or marginalization of other groups. So let's talk about cisgender privileges. Cisgender privilege, you're going to go to the bathroom and the locker room, and it's going to be other women, and so you don't have to worry about that gendered violence. Maybe not. This is crazy, this not choosing between either feeling invisible through passing or being regularly othered by being out. Understanding that as a cisgender woman, I don't have to worry about my identity because my identity is a conforming identity. So I am in my conforming identity. So as a woman, a biological woman, I am embracing my biological characteristics, and I also embrace some of the social constructions of what it means to be a woman. So I don't have to worry about trying to pass as a woman or being outed by someone or othered by someone. That is so very, very important. This feeling of invisible is also important. I'm going to tell you all a story about that today. So when you're talking about trans women, right, and the oppression that trans women have to experience, we don't have to experience that. Your boundaries are by and large respected, right? So as a woman, my boundaries are going to be respected because I am in my cisgender privilege. Your name isn't questioned. My name is Zoe. Zoe is a girl's name, and so my name is conforming. So I don't have to worry about somebody saying that, well, you were born a boy. Somebody on this chat right here, I'm talking to somebody. Somebody on this chat right here is feeling that. Well, you were born a boy, and your mother named you Troy, and so your name is not Troya. I'm going to call you Troy, right? That's cisgender privilege, and that is the ability to use your cisgender privilege to marginalize and to force your identity, on another group. Generally safe in sex segregated spaces. So a group of us women are together at the AAUW meeting and we're all cisgender women, then we can feel safe in that space. Well, what about our trans women, right, who are identifying as women and they want to come into this space? Do we as AAUW say, nah, well, you were born a boy, and so no, you don't get to be in this space? How do we negotiate that, right? That is using our cisgender privilege to marginalize other groups. Your ID won't cause you trouble. You see yourself represented everywhere. You don't have a potential transphobia when making friends. Murder, harassment, and physical harm. Body parts aren't forced to be the front and center when dating, and easier to financially support yourself. Listen, you can take cisgender privilege and put any privilege there, and you will have that same dynamic. And so when I ask that you all after this, write your privilege and then write how not acknowledging your privilege can marginalize other groups, is very, very important that we view that from this lens. So I'm a Black woman. I'm gonna tell you all a story because I took my students and I teach at an HBCU, and HBCU is an acronym for Historically Black College or University. So I'm a professor at a school where the majority of the students at the school are African American. The HBCU was necessary because African Americans couldn't go to white schools back in the day, so they had to develop Black schools to educate the newly freed enslaved population. So I took my Black students into Richmond to the Virginia Library today. There were probably about 12 of us who had coagulated at that time. And I went to the reference desk, and there were two Black women, and then there was a white man and a white woman at the reference desk. The two Black women were talking to two white patrons, and when the white patrons left, one of the Black women left, and the other Black woman went to her computer. The two white people were talking to each other, and they never stopped, even though we were. I stood there for about 5 minutes, and my students said, "Well, Dr. Z, are you going to say anything?" And I said, "No, don't say anything. I just want to wait, and I want to see how long it's going to take them to acknowledge my presence and how they're going to acknowledge it." I stood there probably for about another 2 or 3 minutes, and it took a young Black woman to come to get us. The two white people never stopped talking to each other, and the Black woman, who was probably ashamed because of her internalization of the intersectional oppression, never acknowledged us. And so the feeling of invisibility is absolutely, absolutely, absolutely significant. And there are so many spaces where we think we're doing well, but we do create the invisibility of people who don't look like us and who don't belong to our socially constructed privilege. You can go to the next slide. That was long. Absolutely, Marge. Absolutely.
Well, and I think we also experience it as we get more gray hair. All of a sudden, you're invisible at the counter.
Absolutely.
Not as bad as what you just recounted, but now this slide, we want you to actually try to do this. If you can open a new tab and go to intersectionalityscore.com, it has a listing of all the different characteristics that you might be discriminated on that basis. And each of these, you can move the slider to the right or to the left. And so I was playing with this when we were talking about this webinar. And so I moved my slider to the white. I'm a cisgender, so I put straight. I'm female, cisgender. I left it in the middle because I'm not rich, but I'm no longer poor like I was when I was a child. I'm in the older category. I'm still able-bodied. I speak English. I have a college degree, so I put more educated. And I left the religious ones in the middle because I think the things that we looked at before indicate that Christian Protestant is the dominant power structure. And this, you know, being a Christian, or perhaps being a devout Christian, or being an atheist, I don't think is as important as a comparison between Christian and Jews or Christian and Muslim. So I'm not so enamored with these last three sliders. But if you go to this site and move the sliders according to your own situation, then you'll get an intersectionality score. And it's a way of just a different way of indicating how much privilege you have compared to others. And then they provide information on giving to people who are less fortunate or less privileged than you. And we're not necessarily endorsing that part of the page, but this exercise, I think, is a good way to think about what areas we have privilege. We may feel like we have no privileges, but we are educated, we speak English, we're probably able-bodied. So we do have some privilege that we might not think about, you know, like many marginalized groups. For example, there is a young Black man who lived in Naperville, and Naperville is a fairly affluent suburb. And he lived in one of the subdivisions, but he was stopped by the police as he was driving in the neighborhood because of the color of his skin. And he was not breaking any laws or anything. And so that kind of fear about what's going to happen, or just annoyance of being stopped for no reason other than someone thinks that he doesn't live in the neighborhood because of their prejudice or learning stereotypes. You see it pretty much all around us. It's just, I think we need to become more aware and understand the scope of the topic, intersectionality.
Elaine, and if I can jump in on that, because I think what you said is absolutely so profound. And I want to piggyback on that story, because and the core with intersectionality, and the takeaway that I would want the sisters who are all on this webinar to walk away with is to really move to making other people not the other, like erasing the them and the they and the those people, and allowing them to be subjective to ourselves, right? So as an example, you gave the example of the young man. Even when you're talking about in an education setting, how do we look at, children? How do we look at kids who aren't the same race, of the same class, the same ethnicity, the same religion? Do we look at them as extensions of ourselves, or do we look at them as the other? And what's so important is that when we're dealing with intersectionality and when we're looking through that lens, to make sure that we don't look through that lens as the other. Because when you look through the lens and then you view people who aren't members of your socially constructed group as the other, then you kind of remove the empathy away from those people, right? When you look at people as extensions of yourself, when you're talking about your oppression, and you look at the oppressions of other groups as extensions of your oppression, the way that you handle that is different. And so when you talked about the young man who got stopped in the affluent neighborhood, here I am, I'm Zoe Spencer, I'm doing this webinar on intersectionality, but that young man could be my son, right? And
Right.
and as a Black woman, as an example, Black mothers have to deal with their sons in that capacity all the time, because people view our sons as being the others, right? And so a part of the move and the movement in understanding intersectionality is also making people subjective to ourselves, as opposed to making people objective to ourselves. And the next slide, yes. This is the final slide, how to be better allies. A lot of times when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about race, racism, classism, homophobism, whatever the social construct is, people get a little bit tense, right? Well, I'm not a racist, or I'm not a sexist, or uh, I think the core to being an ally is understanding that we're not always going to experience each other's oppressions. But the key is to not allow our social constructs to be the metrics that we define other people's struggles in. I'll give you an example. Um, I'm a Black woman. I experience oppression, and then a transgender woman comes to me and says, well, Z, it's nothing like being a trans. Well, you don't know what it means to be it. Well, I experience it because I'm a Black woman. I experience oppression every day. We can't be better allies until we acknowledge that we may not understand what other people's oppressions are, but we have to give them the space and we have to give them the voice to be able to express, to be able to speak, to be able to be heard, to be able to be in a safe space where we provide understanding or empathy or even just silence when we don't understand, and that we learn from other people as opposed to judging other people's oppressions based on our own proximities to power. So, Me Too movement, Tarana Burke, talking about ending rape culture, the Women's March, of course, my grand thing, pay equity, the oppressions that people experience every day, marginalizations that people experience every day based on those intersecting oppressions. How to be better allies is to allow people to experience and express their own stories and their own narratives without imposing our privilege on their struggle. I'm going to say it again. Allowing people to experience and express their own narratives without imposing our privilege on their experience. That's how to be a better ally. And that's it, I guess, for me. Are there any questions, comments?
I think that's really important, to share the stories and to listen to each other. Don't jump in from your own frame of reference. Really understand what the story represents. I was just in a book discussion group where we were talking about some of the terrible things that we have done to Native Americans. That's another whole chapter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you think about indigenous people, they're invisible. We have created invisibility around the indigenous people. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. I look forward to doing this again. I want to just thank you guys for having me. Thank you all for tuning in. And yeah, look up Pat Hill Collins, Trisha Rose, Kimberly Crenshaw, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth. Read some of their works, and I'm looking forward to you all's evolution, and now intersectionality. Thank you all so much.
Well, we thank you for taking the time. I know it's later in Virginia than it is in the Midwest, and we really appreciate you sharing your expertise, your experience, and widening our horizons. Thank you very much. You're awesome again.
Thank you. Yeah, y'all are awesome too. Take care, y'all. Thank you so much. Give the ladies my love.
All right. We will.
Okay. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.